everybody. I would think it's fair to say that in the past, Porsche have often struggled with getting their entry-level cars right. The 912 is almost entirely forgotten to all but the dedicated Porsche fan. The 914 is a real oddball of a car, and I haven't seen one in a very long time. And the 924, when it was released, was decried as simply a Volkswagen wearing the wrong badge. So for the introduction of the 944, which is heavily based on the 924, Porsche worked very hard to try and make something a bit more worthy of their own crest. To that end, they gave it their own engine, pretty much half of the 928's V8. And they created, in my mind, a pretty darn good car. Decent looking, good handling thanks to its 50-50 weight distribution, although I don't believe that's the perfect weight distribution, and transaxle gearbox, and it's a decent recipe. For an awfully long time, the 944 was the bargain Porsche. 10 years ago, I was offered one that had just had a load of work done to it for £700. Sadly, back then, it would have cost me even more than that to insure it, and I didn't have £700. So I never got my chance to own a 944. Later, I did own a Lotus XL, which is really Lotus's equivalent to this car, and I greatly enjoyed the experience. And today we're looking at what is for many the sweet spot in the 944 range. You see, in 1985, the 944 was upgraded and it got a much more modern, rounder interior, nicer exterior styling, and a few extra features. It has power steering, electric windows, it's even got an electric sunroof, which can also be entirely removed. I think you might even have electric folding wind mirrors. You've got proper stays for the bonnet, which is very nice when I'm taking photographs and all that jazz, and it's a pretty comfy, nice car. We've got this lovely velour interior, very trendy for the 80s. And in about 1985, Porsche introduced the 944 Turbo with an absolutely crazy 220 horsepower. It was a pretty popular model and had different exterior styling again. It was a very well-regarded car, and actually, in the right hands, a Turbo 944 was seen as being faster than the contemporary 911. In 1989, Porsche introduced this, the S2. Now, a lot of people mistakenly think that it's a Series 2 car. It's not what it means. What it means is it's the second S. Porsche had already done a 944S, and this was the next version of that. Now, it took some of the styling from the Turbo and then bored out the 2.5-litre four-cylinder into a 3-litre unit, which then gave it almost the same amount of power as the Turbo. In fact, only about 10 horses less at 210 brake. It was, so I'm told, at the time, the largest four-cylinder car engine in production. And that no doubt caused some problems, the same that the 968 suffered later, because, well, people back then wanted more than 4 cylinders in their sports cars. However, the engine is pretty robust, it's a decent unit, and this car's obviously less complicated than a Turbo. You could get them a lot cheaper, and making nearly the same amount of power, they were seen as being pretty much the best of both worlds. Indeed, a 944 S2 has always been a car that I've lusted after. Now, with prices for them on the rise, after decades of being slumped way behind the 911, it's as good a time as any to re-examine this car and see if it deserves its status as a proper cult classic. I also have the benefit recently of having driven a 968 Club Sport, pretty much the swan song for the transaxle 911 alternative, and, well, a pretty well regarded car in its own right. I can tell you, from only a few miles of driving, that this is a very different car indeed. Now, this particular example, which has been kindly loaned to me by its owner, Ewan, is not in perfect condition. He'll be the first person to say that. Like many of these cars, it's been through the mill and it's spent a lot of time as a cheap car. That means it has suffered a little bit. It's had a respray, which wasn't really very good, and you can see that it's tatty in a few different places, but he's been keeping on top of it, and most importantly, he's driven it, and he's enjoyed the car, and he's just kept on top of maintenance. The car has been, I'm very happy to report, very good to him, which is curious because the other person I've been dealing with a lot this week, George, said that his 944 was nothing but trouble. George and his partner Caitlin run the local chapter of the Porsche Owners Club of Great Britain. They are the R2 stalwarts, and that means North Scotland. Quite a big area for them to police, and they do a very good job of it. So much so that they were Region of the Year last year, apparently. So if you happen to have a Porsche and you're in the north of Scotland and you want to partake in some events with like-minded Porsche files, then do drop them a line. The details of how to do that will be down in the description below. So this car then, it is night and day different to the 968 Club Sport. That was a very firm car indeed, and this one actually is quite softly sprung. In fact, I've just got out of a 2.5 litre plain 986 Boxster, which is already soft, and this is similar, if not softer, again. Now, most of the time, this car's owner drives it on 17-inch wheels, but for the purposes of this test, it's been reverted back to the original 16s, and that does make a difference to the ride. I have to say, as a tool to potter about in and as a GT car, it's a magnificent thing. It's very comfortable, you've got plenty of space in it. These are a 2+2, but really what you're going to do is fold those two rear seats down and give yourself an enormous amount of rear stowage space. It's quite a shallow space in the back, a bit Corvette-like actually, so do be wary if you want to pack certain unusually shaped items in there. Can't think really off the top of my head what you couldn't get in there, but it's just something to note. It's a lot better on storage than, say, the equivalent Lotus XL. It's also miles better built. I love my XL, I love it to pieces, and I would happily have another one, but my life, they were not well put together. I mean, just the whole interior and exterior just looked like it had been, well, built by hand, but not in a good way. One thing that is also a disappointment on this car, and I'm surprised about, is the gearbox. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be a this car specific thing, because it's got a huge amount of play. I mean, like that much play that the lever wobbles around. I never recall that being an issue in any other Porsche I've driven. The 968 gearbox, in fact, was actually a real highlight of that car, an absolute joy to use. So this one, I think, just needs a little bit of TLC. The engine is beautifully responsive and the car's nearly warmed through, so we'll give it some beans in a moment, but actually it's got a bit of punch low down. You have to remember, you know, it's only 210 horsepower, but makes a pretty good sound too. We believe that this may have an aftermarket exhaust on it, and actually I would suspect that to be the case, because I don't think these ever sounded that throaty in period. The gearbox does make me worry, because when I go to shift down a gear, I wonder if I'm going to go down a couple of cogs too many, so that it's slightly concerning, I have to say. This Momo Prototipo wheel is absolutely lovely to hold. However, it has had the unfortunate side effect of blocking the most useful parts of the gauges. From where I'm sitting, I cannot see anything between 40 and 120 mile an hour, or between 2,000 RPM and the red line, which is sat at 6,500. It's a bit irksome that. There is no adjustment in this steering column unless I'm being very much mistaken. The stalks here will be familiar to anybody that's driven a Porsche product of the period. They're pretty nice to use actually. They've got a bit of a retro chic about them. I quite like them. And now we make our sacrifice to St. Damien, the Lord of Beans. Can rather get a wriggle on this thing. It's a totally different experience to the 968 Club Sport. That you drive in a fairly modern fashion actually. The chassis will do precisely what you tell it to. Really super responsive. This one is quite old school. Actually very similar to the Boxster I've just got out of. It takes a moment for everything to wait up. The response is there in the steering, but it's the rest of the car that takes a moment to get its act together. But it's not a bad thing. It's simply a characteristic, and it's how I would expect a car of this vintage to drive. It's actually really very rewarding to hustle. The engine sounds glorious, really nice actually for a little four-banger. 16 valve as well, which means that you do need to rev it out to get it to do its best. There are a lot of unusual noises coming out of this thing too, making some very worrying sounds, but I have faith in its owner that it's all good and above board. It has just been MOT'd after all. I think that 5-speed box actually wants to be much more responsive and nice to use than it is. It's actually quite accurate, but it's just the lever itself is all over the shop. And when I peer down, It turns out the car's actually pretty brisk as well. Really punchy. Maybe that's not a surprise, because the box stuff come out of actually is pretty much the same power, and that didn't seem to lack for pace either. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is probably a torquier engine as well. Oh, it's so nice to work your way down the gears, just load it up, get it into a bend, give it a little change up, through. Brakes really quite nice, although I have been forewarned, they are the Achilles heel of the 944. I mean, not really a surprise, it's a 90s car. Most 90s cars, brakes are not up to scratch, or certainly not up to modern standards anyway. And so if you do want to invest in one of these, as say a track toy or for spirited drives, that will be the first area you probably want to look at. But this road actually has quite a few imperfections in it, and I have to say, this is soaking them up with absolute ease. And really much quicker than I expected it to be. This is a fun car. This is really fun. And it's pretty basic in here. Does not feel luxurious at all. In some ways, actually, the old XL's interior was a lot nicer, because there was loads and loads of leather everywhere. But then the switches were also much worse to use. They felt nasty, cheap and horrible, because they were. The engine in this and the Lotus, they're quite different. The Lotus really thrived on revs, and this certainly needs them as well. The Lotus has a little less power. It's 180 brake in an XL SE, but it just felt a bit keener. The XL is also the lighter car as well, believe it or not. This is not heavy, but the Lotus really was a flyweight. This certainly feels like the far better constructed car, and if you want to do big miles, it's probably the car that I would choose. For a blast, the Lotus is going to deliver the thrills. So with these getting more expensive now, are they a decent car to invest in? I would say yes. I would say to go for a late car, and if you can afford an S2, I'd do that. I wouldn't frankly bother with a turbo. This engine is so exciting and engaging, I just can't really see the turbo being that much better. It's going to be faster, but then if speed's what you're after, there are much better ways to achieve that, really, for the same money. The big issue is going to be service history and getting these cars properly looked over. The simple fact is that many of them spent an awful lot of time as, well, dirt cheap runabouts that were considered pretty much disposable by their owners, meaning that there's a lot of them that are in less than ideal condition or hiding some pretty nasty and expensive secrets. They aren't bulletproof, but the sample group that I've got to work with seems to come back with pretty wildly opposing reports of how good they are to live with. So you pays your money, it takes your choice, really. With any car of this age, I'd always budget at least £1,000 or so for just general maintenance items, refreshing the bushes, going through stuff, and there'll always be things that you find. No matter how good a car is, I guarantee you are going to find something. Get yourself a friendly local specialist. Do not take this to a main dealer, honestly, it's pointless. Burn money, it'll be quicker. But with its low slung driving position, great panoramic view out the front, and gorgeous mechanical feel, balanced chassis, the 944 S2 is a hell of a car. The 968 is definitely quicker. It's a great package, a really fantastic car, and some people prefer the looks of it. Other people like pop-up headlights. Hey, they're both brilliant cars. They're very different characters. If you want something a bit more modern feeling, go for the 968, the Club Sport, whatever. If you want a classic car that's usable, practical, a bit different, 944, it's a good one. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks to George and Caitlin for organising this review. Thanks to Ewan for lending me his lovely car. Thanks to you for watching. Please like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all for the next one. Bye bye.